Welcome to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight I'm talking with Brian Cannon. And the discussion we're going to be having is on redistricting. Redistricting is on the ballot this November, and a new campaign has rolled out called FairMaps Virginia. Brian Cannon is someone I've spoken to previously over the last 5 years that he worked for One Virginia 2021 regarding nonpartisan redistricting. He is now heading up this campaign called FairMaps Virginia, which you can find at fairmapsva.org. And we're going to be talking tonight about what you need to know as a voter going to the polls in November about this initiative that will be an amendment to the Constitution of Virginia. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for having me.
So we talk like at least once a year, it seems to me, and you have, again, been working on this for 5 years, raising up the issue of what is wrong with our current redistricting, how politicians pick their voters instead of the other way around. You have done such heavy lifting on helping the voters of Virginia understand why we need to pay attention to this. But now we're getting down to the wire, because I'm going to let you explain to our listeners the process for actually getting something on the ballot to amend the Virginia Constitution. So why don't you start from the beginning?
Yeah, so in a lot of states outside of Virginia, it's not easy, but it's more direct. You and I, Catherine, could have a good idea for putting something on the ballot that, everybody should have a unicorn, and we can get signatures, collect a bunch of signatures because everybody loves unicorns, and then it will go on the ballot, and then people will vote for it because everybody loves unicorns, and then unicorns will be in the Constitution. That's how you change it in California and Michigan and other places. In Virginia, we've got to go through our legislature, and not just once, but twice. And there has to be an election in between. It's like all these extra hurdles. And then it finally gets to the people for an up or down vote. The good news is it only requires a simple majority at every step of the way, which we've gotten thus far. And so we passed the constitutional amendment in 2019 under Republican control. And then we passed it again in 2020 under Democratic control. And now Virginians get a chance on November 3rd to vote yes or no on the amendment.
Right. And so you have been, in your role as the executive director of One Virginia 2021, and I was one of the people standing at the polls, actually asking people what they understood about this, and did they understand how redistricting was done? And a lot of people really didn't. So why don't we start with the census? And let's also talk about how this year is so different from every other year in the history of the country and the world.
It's a mess. So the idea is that these voting districts, our districts for Congress, state Senate, state House, need to be approximately equal in population. Well, how do we know how much our population is? Well, because of the census. It wasn't like the Trump administration was doing a glorious job of collecting the census data in general before the pandemic. But then on top of it, the pandemic has made the census even harder to collect. And so we're looking at actually a huge delay. We usually get the census data from the federal government. We usually get it in February or March. We're probably not going to get it until July or August of next year. And that's what they're saying now, let alone any kind of bounce back on COVID or anything that we hit in the coming months. It's a mess.
It is a mess. And so just to remind our listeners in Virginia how we are so special and so different from the rest of the United States, we are one of 2 states that have off-year governor's races. So Virginia and New Jersey will elect a new governor next year in 2021, which is why we get the census data earlier than everybody else, is to redraw our districts before that election happens. But with the delay, and now them saying maybe we're going to get it July 31st. This really has thrown everything into a much broader debate beyond just this amendment, but whether or not we can even realistically redraw the districts before 2021. So what are our scenarios? What are the possible scenarios for what could happen?
So I worked with George Barker on this, and the way he explained it to me was, take election day and walk back all the things you have to do for, notification, military and overseas, voters, printing ballots, getting people to have enough time to collect signatures to get on the ballot, all those kind of things. You walk back and then do it again for a primary. And you really end up with a kind of a drop dead deadline of we have to have maps in place by early June to be able to conduct a November election. And since we're not even going to get the census data until July or August, or God help us later, there's really no way that we're going to be able to use census data to draw maps. Now, there is an alternative, and a lot of folks don't like this, and I'm not advocating for it, but there is an alternative. Our state constitution does not require that we use census data. We could find some private source of data, an alternative data set, and arguably it could be better than the census, because I don't expect the census to be great, and use that and go ahead and redistrict in the spring like we usually do in Virginia. And this is completely agnostic to whether the amendment passes or not. It doesn't matter the process. This is just a timing issue. But there's real good reasons not to open that Pandora's box, including even aside from the fact that I don't think our legislature could agree on what alternative data set to use, but our friends in Texas and our friends in Western states and in Florida are really fighting to make sure we use census data, because they've got a bigger issue with the Latinx population and citizenship questions. And you kind of don't want to open that Pandora's box to say, we should be, messing around with the data. We should just use what the census provides. So I think the smart money is on the House of Delegates, which is the only districting up for 2021's election, will run under those will run under the old lines, the 2019 lines. They'll run under them one more time in 2021. And then we'll by then have new lines for either a special election in 2022 or in 2023 for back for the state legislature.
And that's the other thing. And we're not going to go down that rabbit hole of the fact that we could end up with, our House of Delegates running 3 years in a row, which none of them want that. Because who would want to run for re-election 3 years in a row? It's bad enough it's every other year. And so again, we're taking something that we've been talking about for a long time, and the pandemic and the census data and the timing of the census data has just added this layer of complexity that in some ways might obscure the essential basic information of what it is the ballot is asking people to decide. Mm-hmm. So let's back up and talk a little bit about the history. And I want you, you are the subject matter expert here, but you have been working on this a long time, and we are not breaking new ground here, because there are other states, including California, that have put together a commission and done amazing detailed work. And California is so much bigger than we are too. But I heard the people speak at the presentation that One Virginia 2021 and the League of Women Voters put together at the Sherwood Center in Fairfax City 2 years ago, I want to say. And these commissioners from California really walked through everything they did, the community meetings and all of the things that they put together to make sure that the districts were not just based on census, but on communities and boundaries and natural boundaries and communities of interest. And it was amazing. And so I just want our listeners to understand that we are not reinventing the wheel. We're not doing something that's never been done before, or we're not doing something that we don't know if it's going to be successful, because other states are actually doing this. So for those of you just joining us and wondering what we're talking about, this is Making Change Radio. And what we're talking about is redistricting on the ballot in November. And FairMaps Virginia, of which Brian Cannon is the executive director, is tackling an education issue as we speed toward our election day in November. So Brian, back up to the beginning of how this started and how it has evolved up until this legislative session.
So we've been working to get legislation through the General Assembly, whether it was just a referendum on the ballot that would be advisory only, just saying we want fair districts, or whether it was putting one line in the state constitution, or whether it was coming up with some alternative sets. We've been throwing things up on the wall to see what sticks. And finally, we had this unique moment in Virginia, probably in Virginia's history, where it was very apparent in February of 2019 that the Republicans, who held a narrow majority in the legislature, were on their way out. They knew they weren't going to keep it that November. And the Democrats hadn't had power in 20 years. So they've been talking a really good game about redistricting reform. So we overwhelmingly pass a first read of a constitutional amendment, the first big step. It passes 39 to 1 in the Senate and 85 to 13 in the House. So overwhelming bipartisan support. Everybody's on board with it. Then you get to November, the Democrats take over, and to their credit, there were a few folks that were saying, who were Democrats, were saying, I don't like this, it's not my favorite, and I actually respect for them to be consistent on that. But then all of a sudden, the floodgates open once the Democrats got in power. That a bunch of them that had spoken about this publicly, talked to me about it. All of a sudden, they're like, well, maybe we don't need redistricting reform like that. And so we started changing it. So we had a real slog through the Democratic-controlled House of Delegates this session. So we passed the Senate again. We passed 38 to 2, so we lost one, but okay. And then we ultimately passed the House of Delegates on March 6th. It was 54 to 46. So it was a close vote with a lot of Democrats who voted for it the previous year now voting against it. And it'll be on the ballot in November. So a hell of a fight to get it to that point.
Absolutely. And so the thing about this commission and the fact that one of the sticking points apparently for the Democrats in the House is that it involves legislators, where originally, the idea was that it would involve zero. So right now it's totally done by the legislature, right?
Yes.
Whatever. And generally when you say it's voted on by the legislature, it is voted on by the majority party, and it is signed off by the leader of, the governor, whichever party the governor is in, signs off on it. And so there's partisanship has been woven into this process from the beginning. And so the whole idea of nonpartisan redistricting and creating this commission was that you take the partisanship out because you're going to give it to citizens. But then the compromise was not that. So walk us through, it's like it pinged over here, it pinged over there, and here we are.
Yeah, so funny thing, when you're trying to get legislation for completely independent redistricting through a group of legislators, they all like to be involved in the process. They want to stay there. And this isn't just, we've had plenty of enemies on the Republican side of this, but this is, Delegate Vivian Watts, who's certainly a voting rights proponent and has been good. And she and I probably agree on 95% of all the other issues. But, she stood up at the League of Women Voters meeting this past General Assembly session and said, yeah, I think we should only have a commission as long as there are some legislators on it. So it's a problem in both the Democrat and the Republican side. And so the compromise, in order to get all the other things we got to change this process and move it forward, the compromise was to get was to do a half citizen, half legislator commission. It's not everything I want, but that's a huge step to get citizens in there. There'll be the chair and the vice chair of the commission. So it will technically be citizen-led, which is a huge step for Virginia. And then the other part is it takes it out of the smoky back room. We'll have transparency in there and historic civil rights protections for minority communities, which we've never had in our state constitution before.
That's right. And you hit on something really important. Delegate Cia Price, she goes by Cia Price, and Marcus Simon have been very active in the legislation that was passed this session. And one of those things that passed was HB 1255. Also, that's the Senate Bill 717, which specifically puts language from the Voting Rights Act into how districts will be decided, regardless of whatever happens to that at the federal level. So you might want to just go over why this is so historic in Virginia. I mean, we're doing this as a southern state.
Yeah. Well, that's a big part of it. Virginia's constitution's been around for 400 years in some iteration or another. We have, if you look back at the 1900 Constitution, it was what I would call race negative, right? It mentioned race, but not in a way that anybody would be comfortable with today. Then in the 1970s, we cleaned that up and we took it to what I'll call a race neutral constitution, which is certainly an improvement. But we've never had a race positive piece in our constitution. And that's what this amendment actually does. It guarantees, independent of the federal laws addressing the matter, it guarantees that racial and ethnic minority communities will have a chance to elect a candidate of their choice, and that's historic. Similar, I mean, that's groundbreaking for Virginia and for the South. In addition to that, the two bills you talked about, McClellan's SB 717 and Price's HB 1255, are really good enhancements on that. The constitutional amendment's only about 2 pages long, but those other bills are like 10 pages long because it has a lot of other details we want in it. We have a history in Virginia of having short constitutional amendments. 2 pages is very long for us, but they sure as hell weren't going to let us do 12.
Yeah.
And I think that and Delegate Price and Senator McClellan did excellent work on that and getting additional protections for minority communities, additional protections for just communities in general. Like, we should always treat our communities with respect. And I think we've got the best shot at having those upheld if we have this amendment on top of it. We don't have to have the amendment on top of it for it to be law. It's already law. But if we have this amendment on top of it, it won't be done in a smoky back room anymore. We'll be able to check over to make sure that these things were done.
And let's just draw a fine line here as to why a constitutional amendment differs from simply passing legislation, because legislation can be undone.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Legislation can be undone. Constitutional amendments take a little bit more time.
So, and a lot more effort. We still have, like, for instance, we still have the Marshall-Newman Amendment on the Virginia Constitution, and that's ridiculous since the U.S. Supreme Court has already said it's invalid. But so I want people to understand that this is not a small thing, that we're asking people to vote on amending the Virginia Constitution, because it's much, much harder to undo it. For better or for worse, it's much harder to undo it. The legislation that was passed does give protections, and it's got very specific language in it that is so important about, districts that share similar social, cultural, and economic interests, and compactness and contiguity. That's very specific, but keep in mind, if another party is in power in the governor's mansion, that can be undone. Not so with this constitutional amendment. And so people need to keep that in mind as well, what this means. So one of the things that I think we need to talk about is, just to backtrack a little bit, is the census data. And the fact that census data is self-reported. So one of the things that I know, because I've been working, I've done shows, lots of shows on the census, and the fact that people are not responding to the census. And normally people would go door to door and knock on your door if you didn't do it online, or you didn't answer the phone call, or you didn't send it back, via postcard. They'd knock on your door, and that's not happening. So I know someone asked on one of the radio shows I did, what was the response in 2010? And in Fairfax County, it was 75%. And they considered that just wonderful. But here's the thing, that so 75% of the people responded in Fairfax County, which means 25% of the people didn't. And so they were not counted among the numbers of us trying to fairly redistrict. And so in the current circumstance, we have to acknowledge the fact that, kind of totally separate from passing this amendment, the data that we're going to be working with may not be as accurate as it could or should be. So
I'm very concerned about that, Catherine. You're right.
So the fact that we've passed this legislation that, says that we have to take other things into consideration. This is a positive thing, because it can't just be A, partisan, which has been in the past, and B, just simply numbers. Well, Fairfax County got this many people live here according to the people who raised their hand, right? So we're going to draw the districts. So we're kind of ushering in something, it seems to me, we needed to usher in the 21st century, which is stepping up the fact that we have very precise data. And can you talk just a little bit about the 2010 census and the what happened after the election of Barack Obama, the fact that there was midterm elections right in 2010, and that it was just a time when the controlling party in power specifically knew what grocery store you shopped at, and what magazine subscriptions you got, and what car was parked in your driveway, to understand that they could draw all kinds of lines up and down streets to carve out or pack districts.
Absolutely. Oh, go for it, Kevin.
No, I was just going to say, I just need to tell people again, you're listening to Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we're talking to Brian Cannon, who is with FairMaps Virginia. I need to tell you that before he launches into what happened in 2010 and why we need to avoid this in the age of data.
Yeah, so 2010 was the first time that that big data and supercomputers met. Karl Rove, if folks remember from the 90s, kind of ushered in starting to use big data in political campaigns, but the computers weren't as sophisticated as in 2000, 2001, 2002 when they were drawing those maps as they were in 2011. And the 2011, 2012 redistricting was the first time that big data met big supercomputing power. And those two things made for a really lethal assault on our voting rights. This was mostly done by Republicans. Project Red Map, Dave Daly wrote a great book on it called Rat Eft. It's totally worth a read to understand. What's scary to me is that the technology has only gotten better. And if you don't have any kind of reform, not all reform is like California's or everything like that, but if you don't have any kind of reform, you don't have transparency, you can't be a watchdog on this, then this is just going to be weaponized even further. And I'm a Democrat, so I'm a little more happy that Democrats are in charge than Republicans in Virginia. But that's not fair, not the way to do this in the long run.
And there's a step called cracking and packing districts, and that's really what the data is used for, right? So we can put minorities, communities all in one district and dilute their influence in other districts, or we can take a district and crack it open and dilute the voter base in that district by putting people in different districts. And so some of this has gone to the court. Let's talk about the Donald McEachin district. In the fact that, right? So, pretty much Virginia for a long time has been almost 50-50 in how people vote, for instance, in a presidential election. But we have 11 congressional districts, and for a long time, it had 8 Republicans in 11 congressional districts, even though the state pretty much was voting 50-50 on Democratic and Republican tickets. So walk us through the process of what happened with that particular redrawing of that congressional district.
So forever since the 90s, the Democrats, when they were in charge with Governor Wilder, created the first majority minority district in Virginia, and this is important as it to do. And Congressman Bobby Scott, or State Senator Bobby Scott, became Congressman Bobby Scott from that district, and he'll be the first to tell you, because I've heard him speak on this before. They put a lot of African Americans in that district. He was saying, I don't need that many. Please keep them in other districts to help out other candidates, other Democratic candidates in other places. But Governor Wilder apparently told him, this district isn't for you. It's to make sure we get Black representation, and that's a certainly an important and worthy goal. And at the time when white voters were more inclined to switch parties and not vote for the Black candidate, that's really important. Now, that's not true today as much. Empirically, it's not true as much. There's plenty of white Democrats who vote for Black candidates all the time. But what now happened, though, is fast forward 30 years later, and we still only have 1 congressional district. We got 11 congressional districts, but only 1 that has an African American in it. And that's not like a one-off. That's just what we have. And it's because they found every Black person they could along the James River, all the way from Hampton Roads to Richmond, and packed them into 1/3 congressional district, right? That was, and they did it under the guise of, we're following the Voting Rights Act. Well, finally the court stepped in, and Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Clarence Thomas joined with liberals and struck down some of these packed racially gerrymandered districts at the court level. And that's been huge, because now, if you think about it, Virginia is 20% African American. And out of 11 districts, we only have 1. That's 9%. That's a hell of an underrepresentation. Now we finally have 2 congressional districts likely to elect African Americans. And that puts us at 18%, which is probably where Virginia should be as a baseline any given Sunday. And I hope that continues to evolve, because if you look at the Northern Virginia communities up there, there's probably a Latinx influence district. There's certainly some South Asian, growing South Asian population up that way as well. And we should be drawing districts to reflect those communities, not to artificially pack them or artificially crack them up.
Absolutely. And of course, people move around. So within 10 years, and this is the thing about using the census, once we've done this in 2021, or for the 2021 elections, then we are there until 2031. And a lot of things will happen population wise, movement wise, diversity wise in Virginia. There's a lot of districts in Southwest Virginia that are getting geographically bigger and bigger and bigger because the population there is shrinking. And we have a lot more representation in the Golden Crescent, or the crescent of Northern Virginia, Richmond, and the Virginia Beach, Norfolk Tidewater area. And so people need to pay attention to this, because it's not just that we can change it in the middle if we discover halfway through that the population has changed tremendously. No, this is what we get. So this year really matters in 2021. But what are people talking about as far as trying to kick the can down the road and delay this so that we're not doing this until 2031? Because I have read articles where there is discussion about, why don't we just kick the can down the road?
Yeah, there were a lot of folks in the Democratic House leadership that were adamantly in favor of this amendment, were helping us pass it in 2019. Or campaigning on it in 2019, and then they get in charge and they're like, well, why can't we do something maybe different and even better, Brian? Don't you would agree we can improve on this? Which absolutely, we can certainly improve on any process. And why would we put something imperfect into the state constitution? Let's make it perfect and do it for 2031. And the problem I have with that argument is there's significant and important and very timely gains we can make with this amendment right now, but also no amendment's ever been perfect. I love the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis in it, and that is a perfect example of why perfection is not attainable in amendments. Right? It's the 15th Amendment. It was a brilliant story, but we've never had a perfect amendment, and there's no such thing even as a perfect commission. And what I think is telling to me is I watch that. Oh, we'll do it perfectly in 2031. What I look at is, well, what was your plan for 2021? And when were you going to talk about that, right? Because Delegate Marcus Simon, who's been an opponent of the proposed amendment, put in a substitute. He wrote it on March 5th, or maybe the night of March 4th this year, and he put it into the legislature on March 5th for a vote. They didn't end up doing a vote until I think the 6th, but nonetheless, his commission structure was horrible. It was like a slap together last minute term paper, where somebody pulled an all-nighter. And there were other better ideas out there that he wouldn't even bother to do. So their lack of engaging in this really makes me question the in the long run, don't worry, we'll get it right.
Agreed. So we're going to go to a short break. Those of you listening to Radio Fairfax, please stay tuned and join us after the break as we talk to Brian Cannon of FairMaps, Virginia, about the upcoming ballot amendment that you're going to see on November 3rd.
This is Radio Fairfax, a public access cable and internet station provided by Fairfax Public Access, a 501c3 organization in Fairfax County, Virginia.
Al Cooper, Brooks Williams, Al Stewart, Cheryl Wheeler, Barlow Guthrie, Chris. Contemporary singer-songwriter folk artists side by side with long-standing esoteric rock performers. That's what Eclectic Hours is. It's music for baby boomers, music where you gotta listen to the words. Eclectic Hours, Sunday mornings from 10 a.m. to noon. James Taylor, Kate Campbell, Joe Cocker, Livingston Taylor.
Social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
We're the Census Bureau. We measure America. So if you receive a survey from the Census Bureau, please participate right away. Your community is counting on you.
Radio Fairfax, the go-to station for a truly unique and rewarding listening experience. Made by producers who want to share their love of music, talk, or ideas with you. Free of commercial corporate radio control. Radio Fairfax, your voice, your station.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking with Brian Cannon, who is the Executive Director of FairMaps Virginia, formerly the Executive Director of One Virginia 2021. Thank you so much for being here, Brian.
Glad to be back, Catherine. Thanks for having this important discussion.
It is an important discussion, and I really worry that it's being eclipsed by everything else, which, the pandemic definitely is problematic. The economy is collapsing in on itself. So much has changed since the Virginia General Assembly basically left Richmond in March. And they are reconvening for a special session in August 18th. But to my knowledge, this is not an issue that's going to be one they discuss. Is that correct?
I've been trying to find the answer to that question, Catherine, for quite some time. I don't know. It doesn't seem like it, but that being said, redistricting reform often weaves itself in, either for better or for worse, into every other conversation too, because it kind of bleeds over into everything else. So I don't know, but I hope they'll address it, because there's some things they could do to further clarify what's only a 2-page amendment, to further clarify that and to plus it up before the election. That would be great. And in time to make a difference for the citizen selection process.
So tell us a little bit about, if you had a magic wand and you could write this yourself and have them go, sure, I love it, Brian, let's do it your way. What would that look like? What would it sound like? When we talk specifically about Louise Lucas or Eileen Fillercorn, that's terrific. I love those women. But, 4 years from now or 10 years from now, it might be somebody else. And so we don't know who it's going to be. And I'd rather not rely on just innately assuming people have good intentions, and instead codify into law what you can and cannot do, or what the law requires. And so I would hope people would look really hard at why administrative solutions over the long term may not be the way to go, because they can be undone simply by having some different person sitting there making the decision.
Yep, and I hope we'll get these things done. If not, in the special session on the 18th, during the General Assembly session in January, which will be in time to impact a lot, actually, because those laws will go into effect July 1, but the census data doesn't even arrive until after that. So there are ways to continue to get this done. And what really I hope for, Catherine, is that we can work towards, in the long run, a fully independent commission that has some of the other benefits we've already kind of gained in this amendment, but we can go even further. And I hope folks will be willing to work with us on that in the long run. Doesn't mean this isn't an improvement presently, but everything can be improved, and I would like to keep that process going, especially as we learn more about how this one works out.
And that's a good point too, Brian. Everything evolves, and you don't know what you don't know. And until you actually walk through a process, you're right. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of good, because we need something that is functionally better than what we have right now, which is not good. It just isn't. I mean, if anybody looks at how the districts are drawn in Virginia, it makes no sense. One of the things that, when the gentlemen were there from California, the commissioners were there from California, and they talked about going out and talking to people about, what makes a community of interest, something like the Central Valley of California, which is full of farms, or an area of California that's all about shipping. It's got ports, it's got, and that these are not census and they're not even natural boundaries. It's like they're economic communities, or there are communities that share something and they have a common interest. So the represent them understands the city and the constituency that they're representing. This makes 1,000% sense to me. And so I hope Virginians can see that potentially we could have a much better process than we have now. But even voting for this amendment and putting this into place doesn't mean it can't be better or it can't be improved upon. So people need to understand it's not one and done. We're going to learn as we go, and we'll build.
Let me add to that, Catherine, that I think a real win on redistricting reform is not just passing this on November 3rd with a vote yes. The real win on redistricting reform is getting FairMaps in 2021. Right now, there's all sorts of census delays and things like that, but what that requires is folks to vote yes, but also then to participate in the process. Because if we hold public hearings and no one shows up, that's not helpful. right? If we have open public comment and no one engages, that's not helpful. So what I hope we do here at FairMaps VA, and what my former colleagues, I guess now at One Virginia, are doing, is working on the long run implementation of this. So everything we do now to educate people about voting on November 3rd is also meant to drive them to being a part of the process in 2021, which we just have to have citizen input and participation. The good news is that same technology that got us into this mess is the same technology now that'll be able to empower people and communities to speak up with a voice, to say, hey, this is our community. Please don't crack or pack us up.
For those of you who are just joining us, we are talking about fair redistricting. Redistricting is on the ballot in November. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and I'm talking with Brian Cannon of FairMaps VA. So what's really important here, and I think you said something that has just been an aha moment for me, is that voting on November 3rd to amend the Constitution, to have this commission, is basically allowing citizens to write themselves into the process. It's codifying. It's codifying, saying, I'm writing myself into this process because I care about what my district looks like, and I care about who represents me, and I care that it can't be simply gerrymandered at the whim of whatever political party happens to be in power in my district, my congressional district, my House of Delegates district, my Senate district. No one can mess with that. But I do think this is an important point that I didn't fully realize until right this minute, which is we're voting to write ourselves into the history. Oh, I watched too much Hamilton. We're voting. I know, right? I love Hamilton, but
Same here.
I know, but it is very inspiring. If our listeners have not, you should just totally go watch Hamilton. But you're putting yourself in the picture. You're putting yourself in the process as a citizen. It's not just saying, I'm going to let someone else figure out how our district should be drawn, and therefore, the constituency that someone's going to represent for our district. You talked about the Latinx districts, and I think about the change in Prince William County. 2017, no, I didn't see it coming, but 2017 saw a lot of white Republican men unseated, longtime incumbents, by such a diversity. And Lee Carter and Danica Rome and Elizabeth Guzman and Hala Ayala. And I'm like, it looks nothing like in one day, Prince William County looks so different in the legislature. And I just think people need to embrace the fact that that's the direction that Virginia is going in. Communities will move around, population will move around. Rural areas might shrink further, urban areas and suburban areas or metropolitan areas might grow more populous. But who's in that population, and how do we draw districts that say, that people's interests are truly being represented by the people they elect?
Absolutely. And wouldn't it be great for a system where, and this is what we saw in California, is a lot of those different communities, like I think it's called Koreatown in LA. I've only been to LA once, and didn't go to all the cool parts. But there's certainly a Korean population there, but there's an increasing African-American population there. Some of the Korean folks are moving to a different neighborhood, and there's all sorts of kind of dynamics going there. And I would want a map, and that's what California got, that actually reflects those changing dynamics, instead of what we get today in Virginia. Is it reflects somebody's reelection strategy, right? And that's really what we're up against, is, do we want districts that reflect somebody's reelection strategy, or do we want districts where community members can write themselves in and then participate in the process going forward? And I certainly think the latter is better.
I think so too, and I think people need to understand that they're being given the power to do that. To say that our process needs to be better, that we can have a better Virginia government if we have districts where the person representing that constituency understands what that constituency wants and needs. So let's pivot a little bit to those who are incarcerated. Mass incarceration is a big problem in this country in general, but certainly in Virginia. And so tell us how it's done now, as far as how you count incarcerated people, and what you're proposing should be the switch to a different calculation.
So this is the intersection. Prison gerrymandering is the intersection of so many different things, right? Because we've got a problem with over-policing. We've got a problem with over-policing in minority communities. And then you add on redistricting, which nobody intended prison redistricting to be, when they were doing it, it wasn't meant to be that, but it just by default becomes that. So what happens is we incarcerate a disproportional number of African-American men and other people of color, and then we house them in penitentiaries that are in rural parts of the state, which makes perfect sense. The rural areas want the prisons and the urban areas don't. So that works out just as it should. But what ends up happening when the census comes around on April 1st and counts everybody's noses and where you are, all of a sudden, south side of Virginia has a huge, population boost. And for African Americans, it's like a 2.5% to 3% African American population boost within like a House of Delegates district within the 75th. Like that's a significant amount of African Americans in there where they tried to set that number at 55% to have African Americans there. And that was like the right number to get that. But of that 55%, it was a little hollow because 2.5% to 3% were incarcerated and those folks aren't voting. And more importantly, even than that, the goal of redistricting reform with regard to prison gerrymandering is to count the incarcerated people back at their home county or locality if you can. Now, you won't be able to do that for everybody. It's a little bit of administrative work, but it's important work. So instead of just diluting our population from the urban areas and artificially inflating our population in the rural areas, we would be doing it correctly. We'd be counting them where their homes is. Now that homes are, and those districts would be more proportionate. It doesn't include other things that the census does, like allocates money for communities based on things like that. That doesn't affect that. It's just for redistricting, but that's a really important equitable step.
It really is. And I don't think it's one that many of us have thought about. Yeah, I would not have considered that fact at all. And because of the number of people who are incarcerated on the day that the census is taken, it just gives a skewed picture of who is actually living in these districts. So,
and credit to Delegate Price and Senator McClellan for championing that and getting it done.
They are two smart women. I happen to like both of them very much. And I think a lot of thought has been given to this. And I hope people appreciate who are listening that years have gone into this, years of your career and a lot of other people's careers have gone into this. And a lot of thought has been given to how to make it better and fairer and more equitable for everybody involved. And this is not a conversation we're going to stop having, as you pointed out, if this amendment is passed. The conversation will continue and the evolution of making it better and better is going to continue. For those of you who are just tuning in, this is Radio Fairfax, and I'm your host, Catherine Reed. And tonight we're talking with Brian Cannon, who is the Executive Director of FairMaps VA. And we're talking about the ballot amendment you are going to see on November 3rd when you go to vote. Unless, of course, you're voting absentee in person or you're voting early, which we can do now in Virginia. No excuses. So it may not be November 3rd. Could be earlier. Just reminding you of that, too. Get everything in here while we're doing it. So you've gotten a lot of really good press this week as you've rolled out fairmapsva.org and the campaign. You're also on Twitter at FairMapsVA and on Facebook at FairMapsVA. I got your email this week, and there's been some great articles written, the Richmond Times-Dispatch. So talk a little bit about, Bobby Vassar and Wyatt Durrett. They co-authored a piece that was published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch on Tuesday, basically talking about, as a Republican and as a Democrat, why they see this as an important step in Virginia and the equitable way forward.
So I couldn't be luckier to have my two bosses be two people of the esteem of Bobby Vassar and Wyatt Durrett. For those who may not know them, Bobby Vassar is an expert. He's been an acting cabinet secretary in Virginia, well steeped in Virginia policy, and has also served for multiple decades on the Hill as a top staffer, legislative director, and on a council on the minority staff of a committee in DC. So he's been, a phenomenal source of wealth and information for us, a wealth of information for us over the past couple of years on our foundation board. He jumped over to help chair this. And the other person is is Wyatt Durrett. And Wyatt ran for governor in 1985. He says he's the person mostly responsible for Jerry Belisle's having been governor. Wyatt was the Republican nominee there. And Wyatt's been on fair redistricting since the Republicans were well entrenched in power, thinking we just got to do it fairly. And he's been a big advocate on this. So having Wyatt and Bobby serve as co-chairs has been awesome. Everything we want to do here is as bipartisan as possible. And I know that's not necessarily the zeitgeist that we're in, where people don't want to hear the word bipartisan. They just want to tear the other side down. But that underscores why this amendment at this moment is all the more important, because we do need to build institutions that are worthy of our trust as citizens. And right now we don't have that in redistricting, and we could take a huge step forward for it on November. And that's what Bobby and Wyatt's op-ed was in the Richmond Times-Dispatch today. It was about that step forward and about a better process. And I think that they make the choice pretty clear. We can either have it the old-fashioned way, which we know is bad, or we could try this new way with some things we know are really good and important to do and try to improve.
And those are exactly the kinds of things we talk about here on Making Change Radio, are the people who are out there in front saying, let's try a different way. I mean, the status quo is a hard thing to change, especially if the people in charge of it continue to benefit from it. So talk a little bit about the nuance between nonpartisan and bipartisan, because there's a lot of people who will say there is no such thing as nonpartisan. So if you can't have that as your goal, then so explain the nuance there.
Yeah, that's probably been one of the most frustrating parts in this whole education and I'll say Facebook or Twitter debate on this matter, is that folks keep saying, well, it's not nonpartisan. I would say that California has the gold standard of redistricting in the country. I think that's pretty well established. I don't think that's a controversial statement. But they don't have a nonpartisan commission. They have a commission made up of partisans, right? Like, you've got to have people to do the commission. And and quite frankly, if you excluded people that were Republicans and Democrats, you would be excluding the two major parties, represented. So that's not good either. So they've got a balanced commission. They got 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, 4 independents. We don't have any independent category on our commission, but we do have a balanced commission of Republicans and Democrats. And that's really important. That balance is critical, because if you get that out of whack, then we might as well just let the legislature do it. To the victors go the spoils of whoever is in the majority. So I don't say nonpartisan, I say bipartisan commission for what we've got. I think the real metric we should be looking at is, how independent is your commission, right? Are they all just direct appointees of political folks where they're allowed to put on, other political folks or their campaign manager, things like that? Or are they completely removed from the political process and chosen in some kind of neutral, arbitrary way, like California does it? Virginia got half of that, right? Because, like I said, we couldn't quite boot the legislators out of the room, because legislators on both sides want to be in the room, right? So going back to Hamilton for a second.
I know. Love it.
So we have a half independent commission, and I think that's certainly better than nothing, and certainly better than what we get otherwise, and better than anything proposed as alternatives this General Assembly session, because all of those commissions, and I think this is a really important point, all the alternatives that Democratic House members put up in opposition to the amendment would have either gone into effect in 2031, which is a promise to do things better later, or would have been advisory only, right? So, and that's a really tough thing to ask folks to swallow, because advisory commissions are completely ignored. That's not just in Virginia, though it happened in Virginia. It's all across the country. Advisory commissions have a really, really, really hard time because they have no teeth. And what this commission does is it gets us beyond an advisory commission. It doesn't get us all the way to that independent commission that we really, really want, but it puts us on the path for that.
And talk about the safety net of the Virginia Supreme Court, because I also read an article where a member of the Virginia Supreme Court addressed this idea that the court is not impartial.
Yeah, so that's again, a tough time when people don't trust institutions. So if you study redistricting reform around the country, you've got to have a proposal that says, what happens if this commission doesn't work, right? Because now, granted, every commission has worked thus far. Every reform commission has worked, but you should plan for it not. And in the case of it not, our Democratic opponents in the House wanted it to go back to the legislature, and the legislature could just draw maps however they wanted. right? And that's not a good idea. We know exactly what legislatures do when they do that. The alternative is, I wish there were some, like, we could get a bunch of AP government teachers to get together and draw the maps for us. That would be ideal, but no one's going to buy that answer for us. What the real legal policy alternative is, you send it to the courts. They'll hire a special master. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the last couple of months is Democratic delegates demagoguing our state Supreme Court. It looks very similar to when Trump says, "Oh, that Latino judge can't rule on whatever." It looks similar to that. They're just saying that these people aren't going to do a fair job. And what's interesting to me is there's no evidence for that. If you look around the country, there's no example of a state court or a federal court drawing districts in a gerrymandered way. Now, they've drawn plenty of districts, right? Courts draw districts way too often, probably, but they've never gerrymandered. When the alternative is you go back to the legislature, I can't name a single legislature that hasn't gerrymandered, right? So if we've got a choice between these two options as backstops, then I'd certainly take the court over anything. And if folks are keeping score on partisan rulings for the Supreme Court of Virginia, even just this year, Ralph Northam's had 3 big rulings against Republicans, I would say, if you want to make the left-right argument, right, on evictions, on pandemic response, and on the Second Amendment rally that they had in February. So I think this court in Virginia is not known to be, hyper partisan. They're certainly conservative, though I will say they were also all appointed, and even one this year was reappointed unanimously, except for one of the justices a couple years ago. So the court's not going to draw maps. They're going to hire an expert to do it. That expert's going to draw maps down the middle of the road. They will be objectively fair, and both sides will complain a little bit about it, but it'll be fair maps if the court gets it. But I really hope that doesn't happen. It hasn't happened in other places. I really hope that the citizens and the legislators come together in an open process and really listen to what these maps should be from the community.
Yeah, and I would say that that's a good incentive for the commission to get it right the first time and not send it to the court. But I also agree that there's a different level of scrutiny for the court, because there's no level on which a court could qualify doing it on a partisan basis. I mean, they're a court. So, these are all things I think people need to consider, because it is a complicated issue. But having this commission draw our maps in 2021 and into the future will make a better government for the Commonwealth of Virginia. I believe that. And I wouldn't have given my time to this if I didn't believe that we have got to improve the way it's being done right now, that to accept the status quo, that if we can't make it perfect, then we should just give up for another 10 years, to me is like, no, I don't think any voter should accept that that's our only choice. So I'm hoping that this broadcast helps people to really understand what the issues are and to ask the right questions. So where can people get more information if they want to drill down and we just haven't done a good enough job? Brian, where do they go to find out more?
If you want to really nerd out on this, we certainly have some information at fairmapsva.org. But I would really encourage folks, because I feel like that the uber high information voters that listen to this, you should go find independent experts to evaluate this. And what I would suggest is look at the Princeton Gerrymandering Project's report on the amendment. They support the amendment. They've got recommendations for improvement. They've got all sorts of. They got a huge report on it. They're a really good resource. The Brennan Center for Justice at NYU supports this, and they've been a really good resource for this. My favorite advocacy group in all of the form of good government, I guess probably tied for second, would be Common Cause, and Kathy Fang, who got it done in California when she had to fight Democrats to get it done over there, which she texted me on the night the Democrats took back over and said, "Congrats, your job just got harder," in November. Kathy Fang's been a mentor of mine, and Common Cause has put out a number of things about how to do redistricting fairly and statements on the Virginia redistricting process. I'll also say that Represent Us, which is an awesome anti-corruption organization, supports us. Basically, all the redistricting experts around the country support this amendment. And I think that's a key thing as your listeners are evaluating, where we're saying vote yes. There are other really good, respected people like Delegate Price and Delegate Simon, who are very esteemed in their communities. And I agree with them on 95% of other things. But they're out there saying vote no. And so how do you weigh those things? And I think the best answer is look to the experts. I mean, that's what, as a Democrat, I say all the time: wear a damn mask, people, right? Listen to what Dr. Fauci's saying, right? Climate change is real. Listen to the experts, and listen to the experts on this. And if you look at the experts around the country, you'll see that not only are law professors and also, but all the advocacy organizations are asking you to vote yes.
Thank you so much, Brian. Those are words to live by. I wish you the best of luck. Keep us apprised. Maybe we'll do another show. This has been Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax at 9 p.m. every Thursday.